is Brandon Laviolette, the Treatment, Health and Wellness Program Coordinator at Positive Living BC. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this community forum. It's called Undetectable Equals Untransmittable. Firstly, I'm going to acknowledge that we're gathered here tonight on the unceded Coast Salish territories, which includes the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I just would like to remind everyone to please turn off your cell phones or switch it to vibrate, just as a courtesy to those around you. The presentation tonight is being broadcast live on our webinar. So we have 4 people joining by webinar tonight. And I'm going to welcome everyone that's here, welcome everyone that's joining us on the webinar. Tonight's presentation is also, it's going to be recorded so that we can put it on our website as soon as possible. Just so you all know, just to maintain your confidentiality, the camera is always going to be focused on the presenters. So when you speak, when you ask questions, you're welcome to ask questions. You don't have to step in front of the camera. But just to let you know that it'll just be the presenters speaking to you and they'll be showing on camera. So you see this on the screen here, it's the Momentum study. I've been asked just to, we had our presenter, one of our partners, community partners, was going to invite you all to participate, but he couldn't be here because he's sick tonight. So one of...
we're not going to participate in that.
Thanks, Tom. So one of BC's community partner, or Positive Living BC's community partners is the Momentum study. Momentum is a health study for men who are sexually active with other men that involves a self-administered computer questionnaire and STI testing. Participants will receive a $50 honorarium, which can be received as cash and/or as a chance to, and/or you can get a chance to win a $2,000 travel voucher or a $250 Apple gift card. If you have received a recruitment card from someone in the study, you can call in or go online to book ASAP. If you don't have a card, but you wish to participate, we have a contact list at the back of the room, and we will be forwarding your information onto Momentum, and they will let you know how you can participate. Finally, if you've already participated and you have cards, please hand them around. Pass them out to everyone you know. For every eligible guy that you recruit, you'll receive an additional $15 in compensation. So just if you want to go online, you can go online to the momentumstudy.ca and you can sign up there. So for tonight's presentation, I'm going to ask everyone just to save your questions for the very end. We have 2 presenters tonight. There's going to be a live mic at the back of the room, and we'll just have everyone line up there just to ask any questions that you have. I'm going to cut into that line every once in a while if there's questions from our webinar participants. And if you have a concern about confidentiality, again, our camera is always focused on the front. So you're welcome to introduce yourself by your first name, but you don't have to. It's up to you if you want to use your name. So we'd like to thank our supporters, Gilead Sciences, Merck Canada, and ViiV Healthcare for their generous support of tonight's community forum. We provided some literature and brochures related to tonight's presentation at the back of the room. And also there's some information about other programs we offer at Positive Living BC. You're all welcome to go and peruse that and take some with you. There's also an advanced copy of the next issue of Positive Living magazine. Those will be distributed probably in about 2 weeks. So for tonight, I've distributed our 2-sided Positive Living BC evaluation form. There's one at every single seat. So if you can, before the end of the night, before you leave here tonight, if you can take a few moments just to fill that out for us. The front page is mostly demographic data, where we're just sort of collecting basic data about if you're male and female and what parts of the city that you live in, and if you've been to one of our forums before. So that's really good information for us to have. But other information on the back, we ask for your comments, and it's really important for me to be able to get a good read on how our presentations are for all of our members. So if you have any comments, I really appreciate them, so please feel free to write in whatever you feel is appropriate. Tonight, Dr. Mark Hull will be presenting our Undetectable Equals Untransmittable. And Dr. Hull is a clinical associate professor at UBC. He's a research scientist at the UBC Center for Excellence in HIV and AIDS. He's done infectious diseases training at UBC and a postdoctoral fellowship with the Canadian HIV Clinical Trials Network. So please welcome Dr. Mark Hall.
It's a great pleasure actually to be here tonight and see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. And what's more of an honor is to present with Val, who I regard as a friend, a mentor, and a teacher actually. So it's a tremendous honor to be sharing the podium with Val. I've known her for many years now, and I think this is hopefully going to be a very good partnership because I think we're going to try and tackle slightly different aspects of the same topic. Brandon left it fairly open for me in terms of deciding what I was going to talk about. And what I decided that I would do is perhaps take a historical view of this topic, because if you've been following any parts of HIV research or science or politics, this has been a journey since I started after my fellowship in about 2006. And so there's been a lot of ups and downs and different points of view that have come along and controversies. And I thought it might be very, very interesting to go through it from a historical point of view and focus on where the science has gone that's led us to, U equals U. And as Brandon said, if you have questions, and I'm certainly going to cover some of the trials and some of the evidence that's come along, if you have questions about it, I'm happy to go into details and talk about it later on. But I think it's hopefully going to set an overview of where the science has got to, and then Val is going to talk a little bit about what the consequences might actually mean from a scientific point of view. We have a fancy clicker, so I'll try not to overclick because I tend to do that. So, as I said, for me this is a very interesting topic to come back to. When I started my HIV training with Dr. Montana back in 2006, this was something was just coming to the forefront as a concept or as an idea. And some of my very, very first talks that I had to give at that time were actually in front of scientific audiences, trying to defend his ideas and push this whole idea forward. And it's kind of interesting to think now the world has sort of caught up a little bit where BC has been in terms of its thinking for quite a long time. I think the way that we've looked at it always scientifically is we've had a lot of focus on the virus and a lot of focus on medications. And my training initially was all about this, like here's the viral life cycle, here are the drugs, and how do we use the drugs in an effective fashion. And so my fellowship was in clinical trials, and we were looking at how do we combine these drugs. And I find it so interesting to see that this is now falling to the wayside of things that we care about, because we have some very, very good medications. Some of you may remember back in the olden days when you had to start on medications, it was a handful of pills three times a day. We still see people living with some of the consequences of the side effects and the problems from these medications. When I started in 2006, Dr. Montana said to me, you don't know what it was like when I was first doing this. You have 2 pills a day that you're prescribing to people. You should be so happy. It's so simple. And now if I'm in my clinic and we're seeing people for the first time, as you know, we have handfuls of 1 pill a day regimens for people that are starting for the very first time. So a lot of this has, I think, progressed very, very smoothly and effectively. But this is really focusing on the individual, and we've really focused on improving people's lives in this regard. And some of the data that we can see now is with these new medications, if you're diagnosed with starting medications in your 20s or 30s, you're going to live as long as you're going to live if you didn't have HIV, which I think is one of the most tremendously powerful statements we can make to people when they start on medications or when they're first diagnosed. But what does that really mean to people's lives or their partners or transmission? Because this really is the big thing that's hung around for all this time, which is you should be wearing condoms, it's all about condoms for prevention. What does this really mean? But along the way, even through these time periods, there were little streams of studies that were coming along to suggest that there are different ways to look at transmission, and how do we start now thinking about undetectable viral load suppression and what this means for transmission. So we kind of have to go back to some of the very, very early studies that were done in some of the cohorts, and this is a very interesting one from Africa, in Rakai in Uganda. And basically this proved the basic concept, which is you can't transmit HIV unless you have a significant amount of virus in your system. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about males to females or females to males, which was what they were looking at in Rakai. What they could see is if you had a very low viral load, there were no people documenting transmission to their partners. Whereas as your viral load, I think there's a pointer on here, as your viral load went higher and higher, you were more and more likely to be able to pass the virus on to somebody else. And when did we see those spikes in people's viral load? Basically when they were first diagnosed and the virus was at the highest it was ever going to be, or very many years later, and people's CD4s are dropping and people getting sick and the virus is spiking again. So this was a very clear relationship in terms of viral load and risk of transmission. But then we started to see, well, there are other things that are happening to prevent transmission. So one of the highest focuses of research was preventing transmission in the context of pregnancy. And at that point, we started to use one antiretroviral agent and then combination antiretroviral therapy. And now we began to see, this is just Canadian data, this is seen everywhere else, that basically once we were able to suppress viral load to get it undetectable, in those days, less than 400 copies, nowadays we'd say less than 40 copies is undetectable. We saw no infants being infected. And this was a huge correlation between the thought of what your viral load is doing and what is the risk of transmission in a context. So basically, the theory was, at that point, well, we know if we put you on antiretroviral therapy, we can stop the HIV virus from replicating. At that point, your virus falls to undetectable. We usually only measure people's blood, but the same would be if we measured other bodily fluids. The virus will slowly go down over time. And so theoretically, if we can see this happening for babies, this should be the same for any kind of sexual partner as well. If we can reduce the virus to being undetectable, we should be able to see that you shouldn't transmit the virus on to anybody in that context because there's no circulating virus in your system. And Julio and some of the other people at the center published this paper in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious medicine journal in 2006, so you can see the time frame. And this basically came out around the time of the International AIDS Conference, which was held in Toronto. I don't know if anybody remembers going to that. That was my first conference. I know see some people nodding at the back, and I was overwhelmed. There was like so many people, like what's this all about? And this was actually a very controversial topic at the time. I think they had a small session about it. There were people that were vociferously opposed to this idea and saying, there's no scientific proof, you're using mathematical models, you can't extrapolate from all these other areas and say the same thing would be true for adults or for sexual partners and what have you. So it was actually a very interesting thing to sit back as a junior physician at the time and listen to the back and forth. And people had very strongly held views from years of working in the field. And were like, show us the evidence, show us the science, we're scientists. If you're going to say something like this, start to develop some evidence. Then, a year or two later, things had simmered down, but right before the next International AIDS Conference, which was in Mexico, there was this statement, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, or if not, it's definitely one for the history books, which is the so-called Swiss statement. So here, a group of HIV physicians working for the Swiss AIDS Commission came up with a statement that basically summarizes the early days of what we think now for U equals U. So I don't know if you can read it from the back, so I'm going to read to you the important part, which is basically that you cannot transmit to your partner HIV if the following conditions are met. You've been undetectable for at least 6 months or more, you're taking your medications properly, you don't have any other sexually transmitted infections, and if these things are met, there's basically zero way that you could pass the virus on to somebody else. So this brought it all back into the forefront. And this statement got picked up by a lot of the community organizations, so AIDSMAP and a lot of other organizations picked it up. It was initially just not even in English, and then it sort of got picked up in the English media and into the English literature for science, and came up again as a community, as a panel at the World AIDS meeting in Mexico City, and people were saying, how could you have a statement? Again, there's no evidence. Nobody's generated any evidence. You're basically putting people's lives at risk because you're saying, forget about condoms, just use your rely on the medications. And how can you say this from a scientific basis? So it was actually a very controversial standpoint. The Swiss authors stood by their position. They said, we've never seen anybody transmit the virus. It's not reported if you're undetectable. How much evidence do we really need to be comfortable with from a scientific standpoint? So a year later, this study was published, which was a review of cohort studies. So as you know, cohort studies basically, just enroll people and follow their outcomes. And what they're able to do is join together a whole bunch of cohort studies and say, okay, what was happening when we were putting people who were living with HIV onto antiretroviral therapy? What was going to happen in terms of their risk of transmitting to their partners? And what they saw was basically what we saw for that Ugandan study. As your viral load goes higher, there's a higher risk of transmission. But once you're undetectable and on antiretroviral therapy, they basically didn't see anybody having any major evidence of transmission. I think overall, there were about 5 events that they thought could be infections seen in those studies. And so overall, they said, well, actually, we do now have scientific proof that controlling viral loads with antiretroviral therapy reduces the risk of transmission. So they said there was about a 92% risk of transmission. They didn't say it was 0 because they still saw these 5 cases where there was doubts as to whether or not people on their medications or not on their medications, and they said, okay, let's assume that they were taking their medications, so it's not 100% protective, but it's a massive, massive drop. It's a 92% drop in transmission if you're taking your medications. So for the first time, we actually started to have some scientific evidence to go along with these statements, to go along with these mathematical models, and go along with these position papers and consensus statements that would come around. So people looked at this data and said, well, how can we really conclude for sure? We can't control everything that everybody's doing in those studies. You're just following people, you're just observing their regular behavior. This is not a true scientific method. If you're going to do science, you have to do what's called a randomized clinical trial. So we put people into a randomized fashion. They get one treatment versus another. We can do the same thing here because we don't know for sure whether this isn't confounded by people having other issues or what have you. So based on this, they started to design a study which was actually going to take couples and say, start your antiretrovirals and let's see what happens in terms of risk of transmission. While they started that study, Dr. Montana presented a whole series of papers that really built on this concept and really tried to show at a population level we were seeing less transmission as we were getting people onto treatment. So here's BC data, again published in Lancet. And you can see no drugs before 1996. 1996 onwards, we had drugs sort of climb upward and upward and upward. So more and more people in the province were getting diagnosed, were starting on antiretroviral therapy, and becoming suppressed. And as we saw that, we saw basically a mirror image, which is as people became suppressed, fewer and fewer new diagnoses were seen in the province. So Julio came up with this concept of treatment as prevention. By treating you, it's good for you, it's expanding people's lives, preventing them from getting sick from HIV, but at the same time, by being undetectable, you're untransmissible, and nobody was getting infected. So we saw a big drop off, which has continued to this day in terms of new diagnoses occurring. And so this was a population level study where we could start to show, okay, we can actually see large level effects of people becoming undetectable. Finally, in 2011, again, time for another conference because people like the spotlight and like to be in the media, they released in the New England Journal, which is the top medical journal you could ever dream to publish in, this study called HPTN 052. And this basically addressed the concept of do antiretroviral therapy, by going on to antiretroviral therapy and suppressing a virus, does that basically prevent transmission? And what they saw actually was that it did. So here we had 2 arms of people. One arm of people with their partner said, okay, at the moment, based on our clinical guidelines, we were waiting for people to start based on a certain CD4 cutoff. So if your CD4 was higher than that, you were in the deferred arm, waiting for your CD4 to trickle down before antiretrovirals were indicated. In the other arm, we said, let's just put you on antiretroviral therapy right now, and you can start at this point in time. And this study had to be stopped early because they saw such a huge difference in transmissions between people. So in people that were waiting to start on antiretroviral therapy, there were about 27 cases where their partner became infected. But in the people that started right away, there was only 1 transmission that was seen. And in fact, this person wasn't yet undetectable. He had only been on these medications for 3 months, and so hadn't yet become undetectable. So in the way the study was designed, they said, okay, in our protocol, when we compare this difference, there's a 96% reduction in transmission. But if we had waited until he was undetectable and then started the clock, it actually would be 100%. But based on how the study was designed, they could conclude it was about a 96% reduction. So very, very similar to the 92% reduction just seen when they observed people's data. But scientists are scientists, and they always like to quibble and pick at things and complain and tear other people apart and say your data is terrible. And that's what happened here for this study. So what they said is, oh, but look at your study. Only like 4% of people said they weren't using condoms 100% of the time. And really, I feel that's probably not a realistic statement. But in this study protocol, 96% of people said they were using condoms 100% of the time for every possible sexual encounter that they had. I kind of feel they were just trying to say it to make the investigator feel better because that's what they knew the answer should be. But people criticized it and said, well, maybe it's not the antiretroviral so much, it's the fact that everybody's so diligent and so good at using condoms that that's what's protecting everybody. The other criticism that came along is that this study was in Africa and a few places in America, and it was predominantly focused on heterosexual couples. And they said, well, maybe you can show this to be the case for transmission between males and females to males, but what about gay guys or bisexual men? Like, does the same apply for anal sex? So people were like, that study's good, but look at all the problems we've been able to point out with it. So there was, again, a lot of clinical arguments. Julio believes the study completely. He was in the news, he was on TV, he had TED Talks. He was like, this data is amazing, this proves everything that we've said, treatment is prevention, there's nothing more to be said about this. But the Europeans, they were like, no, that's really not good enough. You haven't proven everything to us. What about gay guys? What about condoms? We've got to really evaluate this all further. So there was a big pause, there was a big regroup, and we had to go back and wait for more studies to try and address some of these holes and some of these issues that had come along. So that led to this study, which was published 2 years ago, or last year, summer of last year. And so here were the Europeans. They were going to basically try and answer these questions. And they had their study, which they called a partner study. And here they tried to address exactly those two problems. They said, okay, let's take people that are not using condoms with their partner. So started the title, Sexual Activity Without Condoms. And they looked at what was happening if people were on antiretroviral therapy. So here in the study, to qualify, you had to be on antiretroviral therapy with an undetectable viral load, which they classified at about 200 copies per mil. And said, okay, if that's where you're starting from, and you're with your partner, and you both acknowledge that you're not using condoms when you have sex, let's follow you for a couple of years and see what happens in terms of people being infected. And that's what they did. So here what we have is a summary of the data from the English group, the Terence Higgins Trust. I always like their summations. They're very pithy and to the point. They were like, oh, we had 14 European countries taking part in the study. We had about 1,600 couples, although I think at the end of the day, they only took data from about 800 couples. In that time period, people reported 58,000 acts of sex where they didn't use condoms. So people were having a fair amount of sex. But at the end of the day, they saw exactly zero transmissions in between partners. That doesn't mean they didn't see any transmissions at all. And I think that's a very important thing to think about for the study that we saw. If you don't mind, I'm going to back up a slide or two, because I think it's important to just talk about, is when we're talking about infections, we're talking about linked infections. So what they're looking at is they can actually match people's viral sequences. So they could say, okay, you became infected in this arm, say these 27 people. Did your virus actually come from your partner or didn't it? Because they can actually measure the viral sequence with some very specific techniques that they did for the study. Nothing that we would do on a regular basis, but something they could do as part of the study. So outside of this, which were linked to their partner, there actually were probably another 10 or 15 infections that did happen because people were not monogamous and were having partners outside of that partner. And the same thing is true for the partner study. There were no infections seen that were linked to the partner that was under study, but people again were not monogamous, and they had about 10 or 11 infections that were linked to people in the general community. So I think that for me is a very important thing, and we'll see it again when we look finally at the Australian data, is I think there have to be conversations sometimes as well about, what's your relationship? Are you open? Are you closed? Because sometimes people focus on their HIV positive partner and forget about all the other partners that they're actually having. They might be higher risk of transmission, and I think it's something that's worthy of conversation. So here we see the summary again of the Swiss statement as summarized by the Terence Higgins Trust, which is one of the big NHS trusts in London. And they say now, after the partner study, we can conclude the risk, in fact, is effectively zero. But they use the word effectively, zero. And the reason for that is this. If we look at science, let me go back and I'll come back to this one, is you always have to put a bit of a range around your numbers if you're going to report your numbers scientifically. So here they looked at everybody in the study, they looked at any kind of sex that you could possibly have, put you at risk for HIV, so vaginal sex, anal sex, with your top, with your bottom, and they basically saw no events in any of those things. But based on the numbers of people that were following and the numbers of events that people reported, they had to put an estimate where they're like, it's 0, but it could be as much as X. And so you can see when they had a lot of people in the study, there really wasn't a lot of variability in the number. But when you only had a small number of people, then there was quite a bit of variability in the estimate. So they said, we could see 0, but it could be as high as 2% a year if you're bottoming without a condom. And so that is where the effectively 0 came up, and still caused a lot of people to couch their message in sort of terms of a little bit of uncertainty because of this. I think the other thing the partner study told us was very, very interesting is the median age is around 40, and people had been on antiretroviral therapy for quite a long time while they took part in the study. So if we look at gay guys, they've been on for about 4 years. For heterosexual couples, they've been on for anywhere between 7 to 10 years of antiretroviral. So they've been very well suppressed for a long period of time. The other piece of data that I think it answers, because sometimes it comes up a lot, is do people actually understand what is meant by undetectable viral load? Like, are they actually very accurate at saying, yes, I'm undetectable versus not undetectable? And Val might talk about this a little bit later, because you asked the same thing in GWAS and we found the same thing, which is actually, yes, people are very good at knowing when they're undetectable. So if they had to look at, if you said you were undetectable, and did your blood actually prove that you were undetectable, it was basically 84 to 94% of people were completely accurate when they said, yes, I believe I'm undetectable at this moment. So that was the partner study, and that really started to rev things up. And that was about the same time that we started to see the first consensus statements for U equals U, starting in about the summer of 2016. But it came to a head this summer, because now, at the most recent conference, which was in Paris in July this year, the final sort of caveat here was addressed again, which is, can we be sure for anal sex that the risk is essentially 0? And here we have now finally the last study, and probably I think one of the last major ones that probably will be done, which is called the Opposites Attract study. So this is an Australian study conducted in Australia, in Brazil, and in Thailand. And they randomized male gay couples to be followed to see what would happen with their partners. So they had 343 partners, one positive, one negative. They had them under observation for about 600 years, so quite a lot longer than what was seen in the partner study. And what they had is they just let people do what they were going to do as part of that normal life. And so they had 72% of people who were on antiretroviral therapy the whole time. 75% of those people were undetectable the whole time. But the thing, again, I think that's very interesting, is 63% of the negative partners reported having additional sexual partners outside of their relationship. And of those people, about 32% of them took PrEP during the study. I think you know what I mean when I say PrEP, HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. So I think it tells us that we have to really not just get blinders and look at people in their main relationship, but realize that people actually are having other partners outside their main relationship and may need other prevention strategies for them. So at the end of the day, for Opposites Attract, for the data that was presented in July, what they saw was this. They had 12,000 episodes of condomless anal sex, so way, way more than was seen in the partner study. And here, the only level of protection was the partner was undetectable. They weren't on PrEP, they weren't using condoms, they weren't using anything else. They basically just had sex, and the partner was undetectable. And again, no transmission events were seen. 0 transmission was seen in that context. Again, they always put a little bit of a range, but you can see the range is much smaller now. So at most, it would be about a 1% risk if we had to look at it statistically. But in real life, in actuality, when they looked at guys having regular sex lives with their partners, they saw no transmission events in the study. And I think for the people gathered in Paris, this really is now probably the last piece of evidence to address all the quibbles and address all the little niggling things that people have brought up along the way. And at the AIDS conference, everywhere, in the conference and in the media was the campaign U equals U. So now we had the final piece of evidence that really puts, I think, the science behind the concept, which is undetectable equals untransmissible. And so the consensus statement from this campaign basically updates the Swiss one a little bit and basically says this. So if you're on antiretroviral therapy and you have an undetectable viral load, you essentially have a zero risk, or negligible risk, as I say, of transmission. Depending on what you're taking for your therapy, once you start, it may take as long as 6 months to become undetectable, which is a pretty average kind of statement. Obviously, if you want this to be the case, you have to stay on your medications, because once you stop, the virus goes back up and then all bets are off. And basically, you should do this and make sure you're getting your viral load checked periodically. So basically, a statement that reflects real life in terms of things that we see, an updated version of that original Swiss statement. And with this consensus statement, tons and tons, I think 65, maybe 500 major organizations, anybody that's anybody in the HIV scientific world signed off on it. They all have very fantastic quotes. They all say very exciting things that support it. In September, the US CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control, which never was going to touch this topic as a barge pole, came out and said exactly this. They supported 100%, which was a huge revolution for the US to have the US CDC say that. And my favorite quote, because I think it's very apropos when you talk to scientists or other doctors, I like to say this one as well, is from Tony Fauci. So Tony Fauci is the head of NIAID, so one of the huge organized research organizations in the US. He's been doing HIV research since the dawn of time. I don't want to age him, but he's been around for a while. And he's basically like, if there's anybody that could be considered a world leader or opinion leader, it's him. And he says this. He says, scientists never like to use the word never, which is entirely true, because you never like to use the word never, because then you're proven wrong and you look like an idiot. But here, he said, we never like to say the word never, but I think in the case of transmission from a positive partner who's taking treatment and has an undetectable viral load, the risk is so low as to be unmeasurable, and that's equivalent to say they're uninfectious. And he says, it's an unusual situation when the overwhelming evidence base in science allows us to be confident that what we're saying is fact. So this is the definitive statement. He basically has put his whole weight of his expertise and his importance to the scientific community behind it, and says he's 100% endorsing the concept of U equals U. And he's telling us as scientists, sure, you never like to say never, but here, this is as close as we're going to get to the data saying never is never, so long as people are undetectable and are taking their medications. So I think for us, from a scientific point of view, all the models, all the treatment as prevention talks that you've probably heard Dr. Montana give 1,000 times really are now backed up by overwhelming science. The rest of the world is sort of catching up with where this position has been. And I think the question really is, now what are the reverberations of this science being translated into real life, and how is it actually going to impact people's lives, and what can we do to make sure this message is getting out to reduce any stigma that could be coming still attached to HIV and transmission. I think it's worth looking at two important things where the Swiss statement and the consensus statement have sort of overlap and update a little bit. And one is this. You have to remember, if you start an antiretroviral therapy, you don't become undetectable right away. So it usually takes a couple of months before we can get your virus undetectable. If we look at a study that was looking at PrEP, actually, and they were following partners, it showed that on average about 65% of people were suppressed in 3 months, about 90% of people by 6 to 9 months. And in that study, you could see the transmission dropped substantially as we let your antiretroviral therapy actually become effective. So in the negative partner in the couple, 2% of people became infected before their partner started on antiretroviral therapy. There was still a fairly high risk in those first few months while the virus hadn't yet become undetectable, which is seen, as you remember, in HPTN-052. But after 6 months, again, nobody became infected. So that's some of the science behind the consensus statement and the Swiss statement to say, just because you're starting an antiviral therapy today, you can't assume you're immediately undetectable. You've got to plan for those first couple of months. And there are lots of studies that are now looking at pairing people with their partner being offered PrEP during that time period, or other things, so that if you are worried about your viral load coming down, that we can make sure we're looking at both people. And with some of our newer drugs that we're using, actually the virus comes undetectable much, much faster than that. So we have a few options for sure.
Could you speak into the mic, please?
Oh, I can, for sure. Sorry. I don't know if it was on, so stuck with me just sort of yelling a little bit more loudly. The final thing that's still controversial, and I think here is where there is difference between what was said in the Swiss statement and what is seen now in the consensus statement, is in the initial studies before we had antiretroviral therapy, it was fairly clear if you had certain sexually transmitted infections like syphilis or other serious infections like that, that there could be a risk of increase of transmission of the virus because it's attracting all those white cells, there would be mucosal changes, and so prior to antiretroviral therapy there was some evidence that having an STI increased the risk of transmission. In the newer studies when people were on antiretroviral therapy, that wasn't seen at all, and in the partner study, 18%, if we just look at the gay men that were involved in that study, developed an STI during the study period. And they saw no effect of having an STI in the partner study where people were undetectable on transmission. So in the most recent consensus statement, the concern about STIs has sort of slipped off a little bit in terms of things that they put in there as a caveat or a concern. So I think then what I might do is start to segue into Val, and I'm going to say just a few other things that I think are worth just mentioning. So as you know, in the province, we have the Seek and Treat program, which is basically our observational data program to see how we're actually doing at linking people into care and upping them antiretroviral therapy. And here's the most recent data cut from the summer for all of BC, and we can see at the moment, I don't know how well this projects again, for people that know that they're positive, probably just over 55% of people, 57% of people are undetectable at the moment in the province. So that's actually spectacular. A few years ago, we were less than 30%. Now almost 60% of people in the province are undetectable. There are, of course, differences. I think some of the work that we have to do should focus on young guys or young people, not just guys, because if you're less than 30, probably only about 40% of people are suppressed. As you get older, of course, people take their medications much more effectively, and everyone is almost suppressed. And of course, the other work that we have to do is look around the province, because if you're living up north, if you're living in the interior, there's still big systems problems that we have, and we're really struggling to get people into care and find a way to help them become suppressed. So, is it making a difference in people's lives? Val will touch on this. This is a study that she was involved with from the women's program called CHIWAS, and they actually had just published a few weeks ago the impact of the concept of U equals U in terms of people's lives. And just to summarize, and Val might talk about this, is people living in British Columbia had a much greater awareness of the concept of treatment prevention, or U equals U, than other places around the country. And it seemed that for people that believe this concept, they felt much more comfortable having sex without condoms with their partner. So I think for some people, they're definitely taking the message to heart, and it's hopefully improving people's lives in some aspects, but there's some others that are still problematic, and Val will touch on that in a second. So I think maybe I went through that very quickly, but hopefully in a way that didn't bore you completely here. And I'm happy to take a lot of questions when we have our question queue. I think for me, the evidence is overwhelming. If you're on antiretroviral therapy and undetectable, there's no risk of transmission whatsoever, and I'm happy to say this to people when I see them in the clinic. I think we have to remember there could still be a small risk in the first couple of months. And I think the other thing that we need to start talking about, perhaps at a community level, is really we can't just have blinders on and focus on one person. Many relationships are open, and we should be open to talking about other prevention strategies if we're looking at prevention, because people may be undetectable, but they may be having partners outside of that relationship, and the risk still applies. In the partner study, the risk for partners was actually as high as the general population in terms of risk for HIV infection. So it really tells us, people have to communicate, and we have to be open to having conversations about other prevention strategies. So Val, I don't know if you have slides, but I'm going to close my slide set and hand it over to you.
So, sorry about the technical difficulties. The remote microphone went off. Hopefully everyone heard most of that. The presentation was really, really good. Before I introduce Val, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Normally, when we do these community forums, we have a clinical presentation like Dr. Hull just presented. And then I invite one of the community members, one of our members from the society, someone in the community to come and share their story. Now, the story of being able to tell you that I'm HIV positive and I didn't give it to my HIV negative partner, I think can be a little bit dull because there's really not much to it beyond that. So we decided kind of to segue this into, Val's going to talk a little bit about criminalization and how the U equals U equation affects the current Canadian laws about criminalization. So just a couple of words about Val. Val Nicholson is a peer navigator at Positive Living BC. She is the past president, the past chair of the board of directors. She is the chair of the steering committee for the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization. She is the first positive woman to be the chair of the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. She's the co-chair of the Red Road HIV AIDS Network and a board member at AIDS Vancouver. Val's a grandmother and a spirited warrior woman with a degree in life.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Dr. Hall. So glad to be your patient friend and colleague. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral traditional unceded territories of all the Coast Salish peoples around the Coast Salish Sea. A big thank you to Alison Symington from the Canadian HIV AIDS Legal Network who gave me the training on this, Positive BC, of course Dr. Mark Hall. I'd also like to thank Neil Self, your current chair of Positive Living, who decided to stay in San Diego, so he is not presenting tonight. And and thanks to Vive Healthcare, who actually sent Neil and I to the conference down there. So I've just gotten home from San Diego from that conference, and so I'm not polished on these slides. So, undetectable equals untransmittable, U equals U. Hey, I'm transmittable, so I can date. But in the eyes of the law, where are we? So first of all, let's define criminalize. Does everyone know what it means? Do I have to go through the slide? It's to reduce, to make it punishable as a crime. And U equals U is great, but we can still be criminalized for living with HIV. Criminal law in Canada is a federal law, but the provincial and territorial courts administer their own justice. Some Indigenous communities also have control over this law. And that is the reason that everyone that is in the court system has their own values and own views on the law. And ignorance of the law is no defense. So saying that you didn't know you had HIV is not a defense. But if you're not tested, so you've never been tested for HIV, and you have it, you cannot be charged. So the criminal law in Canada, in order for a person to be found guilty of an offense, each element of the offense must be provided beyond a reasonable doubt. Not guilty doesn't mean you're innocent. It means that all of the elements of the offense were not proven beyond that reasonable doubt. And the elements of the offense include both actions and mental states. So that means, did you have intention to do it? Was it negligent? Or was it just willful blindness? I almost felt like I was a lawyer when I finished taking this. Oh, I don't ever want to be a lawyer. So the key players in the criminal justice system, first of all, is the victim, they call them. So, and of course we have a case right now in BC where the press is using that word a lot. The victim of all the people that he may have had sex with. They become the complainant. The defendant is the one accused of breaking the law. Crown Counsel is the one that represents the government and make the decision whether or not you are to be charged. So they're the ones that look at all the evidence and then they make that decision. Defense counsel is someone that you would have to defend yourself. The judge, of course, is the decision maker and actually has control over that courtroom. A jury, if it goes to jury, is a group of citizens brought together. And you have to realize that a lot of the jury and they get your name for the jury duty is if you vote. So please don't stop voting, but that's how you get picked for jury duty. And you gotta realize it comes from a great cross-section, and you gotta realize that most of them have never encountered HIV in their lives. All the police do is enforce the law and make the arrest. They do not make any judgments of whether you should be charged or not. So it's the criminalization of HIV non-disclosure in Canada. So it's not whether we transmit or not, it's whether we disclose that we have our status before having sex. And that came with the legal obligation to disclose was established by Canada versus Courier. And then 2 Supreme Court cases followed, and where they used that as a model for prosecution. The level of risk of HIV transmission is a determining factor with respect to whether HIV disclosure is required before sex. So, like I said, people can be prosecuted even if the virus is not transmitted, and even if there is no physical harm occurs. Okay? This law of non-disclosure actually falls under the aggravated sexual assault law. Aggravated. There's somebody in Canada right now serving 22 years for non-disclosure with no transmission. He did not infect anyone. Okay? If convicted for not disclosing, a person living with HIV like myself will spend time in jail, and for the rest of your life, you will be registered as a sexual offender. And to be registered as a sexual offender, that means if you travel in a car, you have to register that license plate. If I go to pick up that person, they have to register my license plate. If you're leaving the community for more than so many days, you have to inform them. If you go for a job, you have to let them know that you are a registered sexual offender. And all you have done is not disclose your HIV status. So this is a little bit of old data, a couple of years old. So there's 70,000 people that have been diagnosed with HIV in Canada since 1985. That means 70,000 people can be charged with HIV non-disclosure. So more than 175 people have been charged for non-disclosure in Canada alone. A majority of these have taken place in Ontario. And most of these cases are against men who had sex with women. And it appears to be a disappropriate number of black men that have been charged. The first woman charged with non-disclosure happens to be a woman from BC, and she is now a registered sexual offender. So Canada is a world leader. Oh yeah. We have one of the worst laws for HIV exposure and the HIV law. Per capita, we have the largest charges and conviction rate in the world per capita. We are first to prosecute in relation to vertical transmission of HIV. That means when a mother is in vitro, so a baby. And we also had the first murder conviction for sexual transmission of HIV. And he was actually charged twice. And he had 10 aggravated sexual assault cases. So in 1998, like we said, the law was on Regina versus Courier. And the law read that people living with HIV have a duty to disclose their status before sex that poses a significant risk of serious bodily harm. So what we see wrong in this statement is, what is a significant risk? My significant risk is probably very different than your significant risk and very different from yours. Probably very different from the judge. If a person does not disclose in such circumstances, they could be convicted of aggravated assault. But in Canada, more than likely, it's aggravated sexual assault. And that is for the rest of your life. It does not come off. So in 2012, there was the Mabier and the DC case, and that's when they changed the wording a little bit. So people living with HIV have a duty to disclose their status before sex that poses a realistic possibility of HIV transmission. But they kept the second part. If a person does not disclose in such circumstance, they could be convicted now of aggravated sexual assault. So before, they could be just sexual assault, but they changed it now to aggravated sexual assault. And again, in the eyes of the law, what is a realistic possibility? So I call this the 50 Shades of Criminalization because it's not black and white. So if there is no realistic possibility of HIV transmission, there is no legal obligation to disclose one HIV positive status. The definition of realistic possibility of HIV transmission is decided on by the court, not a healthcare provider. So if you can imagine if we had to go to court and Dr. Hall there was the judge, it would be far different if we had somebody that had never been in the healthcare system. Courts have looked at the medical and scientific evidence to inform their interpretation of realistic possibility of HIV transmission. Looked at. Over time, in different courts, in different circumstances, and with different evidence, the interpretation of realistic possibility of HIV transmission can change from court to court, province to province. So it's very gray. But based on the current state of the law, it's safest for us to assume that people living with HIV have an obligation to disclose before, and they only talk about vaginal or anal sex without a condom, regardless of your viral load. So you have to disclose. Vaginal or anal sex with a condom unless they have a low viral load. Okay? So to understand disclosure, so I have no legal obligation if I'm going to have a sexual partner, if he's wearing a condom, I have the low viral load, which the court has picked a number of 1,400 copies. I have no legal obligation to tell that person that I'm HIV positive. So imagine now that I've been in that relationship for 2 or 3 years and I decide to break up. How do I prove that he wore a condom if he finds out that I'm HIV positive? And now he is pissed off at me because I've broken up. So how do I protect myself, not from him, but from the law? So there's some other important points. There's no distinction between silence and a lie. So by keeping your mouth shut or lying, there's no difference. There's no distinction based on the circumstance of a particular encounter, including the type of relationship you're in. So that includes those working the street, that includes one-night stands, it includes long-term relationships. You can be prosecuted even if you had no intent whatsoever to harm your partner. You can still be prosecuted. Unfortunately, right now in Quebec, there is a doctor that if someone comes in to be tested for HIV, he's questioning him, asking him why. And even though it's okay with the two partners, he is encouraging them to go and lay charges. And this is coming from a medical health professional in Montreal. And we've just heard about it this year. There's no need for HIV to be transmitted. The crime is non-disclosure. It's not transmission. So it's just in not telling them that you were positive. So what really remains unclear with the law is what is a low viral load? They picked a number of 1,400 copies. What about anal sex? Because right now as the law reads, they're only talking about vaginal, and there's nothing whatsoever about oral sex. But we have some good news. Charges are being dropped by prosecutors across Canada in several provinces. They're just saying, they're actually looking at the data, they're hearing about the scientific breakthroughs, or information, I won't say breakthroughs because they've always been there, and they're actually taking upon themselves to drop the charges. A judge ruled that even though no condom was used, medical evidence of negligible, and I can't say that word, risk, which is an undetectable viral load, was sufficient for acquittal. But that's one judge's opinion. Seemingly few new charges this year. I wrote this last year. Unfortunately, there's been 3 new charges in Ontario and 2 here in BC. So it seems to come in waves. Again, is that the next slide? Yeah, okay. Gotta remember. So again, we're going to talk about, what about rape? What about if we say, what does no mean? Okay? If you're being raped, do you have to say, hey, slow down a minute, I'm HIV positive? I mean, I don't like to use humor because rape is a very devastating situation for any man or woman to be in, but that's the way the courts are looking at it. So our criminal code, because that is what this M-transmittable is, it's under, or non-disclosure is under the criminal code. And under the criminal code, it says a person commits assault when he or she intentionally applies force. So when I think of an assault charge, that's somebody coming up and smashing you in the face or taking you down with a pipe, hitting you with a 2x4 to another person without their consent. It's not talking about me saying, hey, I forgot to tell you I'm HIV positive. There is no consent when the person submits or does not resist of because of use of force, threat or fear of force, fraud, or exercise of authority. This is our criminal code, and that is where they've decided to put the non-disclosure law with. So we're going to talk about fraud as a sexual assault. So do you want to have sex with me? You agree? Okay. I'm hoping. HIV non-disclosure is considered a fraud because they're not making an informed consent. I haven't given you all the information to make an informed decision. I've just said, do you want to have sex with me? Okay. If there is a significant risk of HIV transmission, and that person may have not consented to the sex, had he been aware of my status. So that consent I obtained fraudulently, and making that consent not valid. So sex without consent is equaling sexual assault. So, do you want to have sex with me? I'm HIV positive. I'm giving that person the information that I want them to have. The disagree, we may be talking about that later, so it's not a defined big check mark. And as you can see, they might just want to abstain until they learn more information, or we have that chance to have that discussion about what it means, especially U equals U. Aggravated sexual assault is, like I said, the criminal code, endangers the life of the complainant while committing a sexual assault. So think about it when you are having sex with your partner. So the last thing we're thinking about is endangering that life. But in the eyes of the law, if we have not disclosed and they're not wearing a condom or I'm not wearing a condom, we are actually, in the eyes of the law, endangering that life. We can serve a maximum life imprisonment. And again, I'm going to reinforce, you'll be a registered sexual offender for the rest of your life. Knowledge and sharing. Get the information. We have a couple of booklets at the back there. And there's a lot of informed people out there. And the AIDS Legal Network is a great resource. You can just phone them up and ask them any question. And I should have disclosed I'm not a lawyer. I just take crash courses in life. And of course in my work with research. But I'd really like to acknowledge that Positive Living BC has been leading the way. In 2014, the Board of Directors unanimously adopted the position paper, which was called The Need for New Charge Assessment Guidelines, HIV Non-Disclosure in British Columbia. And that is about a 70-page document.
70-page document is available on our website.
There you go. We're not printing it out. It is 70 pages. In 2014, our board chair at that time was Wayne Campbell, and our executive director, Ross Harvey, went to Victoria and met with the Deputy Attorney General at the BC Ministry of Justice to present our position paper and talk about U equals U. In 2016, I was board chair then, and along with Neil Self and Ross Harvey, we presented that position paper and real-life stories of our members that have been charged and convicted to the policy advisor at the Office of the Federal Minister of Justice. She was too busy to be on that call, but we actually, after talking, we have a great ally in that office now. In 2016, I was still the board chair. I presented at the HIV is Not a Crime, the National Training Academy in Huntsville, Alabama, where they Skyped someone in who is serving a life term available for parole for 35 years for non-disclosure. There was no transmission. His wife got mad at us. Another gentleman I met, his driver's license, registered sexual offender in huge letters right below his picture. They put it on his license from whatever state he's from. In 2016 and 17, Neil and myself sit on the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization, both on the steering committee and the working group. So Positive Living is really leading the way and really being activists for change. So please be proud of your board. The current board does an amazing job, and the former board members. So the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization, this is us, we're advocating for change to Canadian Minister of Justice, to acknowledge the scientific data which we have, and to change this misapplied law. We have a Canadian consensus statement on HIV and its transmission in the context of the criminal law, and it's on the back table back there. We also have an email petition that is going to the minister plus 7 ministers to end the unjust HIV criminalization of people living with HIV. And you can practice on #HIVCrim. So what I'd like to say is your voices are important. Positive Living is leading the way in activism, and each and every one of you can make a difference, but please be safe and protect yourself from the law. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Val. So to put a little bit of context to that, it seemed like sort of two different stories. They're connected in many ways, but the important thing is to talk about there's a lot of new data right now that's really exciting about undetectable equals untransmittable and what that means for you as community members. The important thing to remember is that the wheels of justice turn very slowly. And so despite the fact that we have all this great data showing that our health makes a huge difference in how we transmit the virus, how this virus affects the community, there's still languishing laws that are outdated and that don't support us as a community. So it's really important for you guys to know that we have to speak out and we have to continue being advocates for our own health and position in the community. So that's the end of our presentation for tonight. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I think of you have quite a few. I'll invite Dr. Hall and Valerie up to the front. I'll leave them with this. So if we can all, if you have questions, line up at the back at the microphone there. Shafi will let me know if there's someone online who wants to comment, and I will stop you then. But one by one, I'll let you guys jump in. So go ahead, Mark.
My name is Mark. I'm one of the peer navigators of Positive Living. I'm also a peer navigator at the Rapid Access Addiction Clinic in St. Paul's. You guys did a great job. My question, and this is I get this fairly regularly question at the clinic. Why would I want to possibly get an HIV test? I mean, obviously for the obvious reasons, but those person's fears of being prosecuted for non-disclosure. And as you said, if the person is in high risk and there's a possibility he has HIV right now, he can't be charged. I don't really see, it's hard to explain to him, you did the right thing, but you could still be charged. And also with the, I get, I remember when that Swiss statement came out, it was a small article in the paper, I had it laminated, I put it in my wallet, it's like a go-to card. But again, the he said, she said, all it takes is a bad one, somebody say, you know what, you've never told me. We never used a condom. And with that person that was recently charged, when you, being HIV, I mean, it sounded like we were like monsters. And I know Positive Living did a lot to put out media releases, and I didn't really see anything from the medical community. Maybe I just haven't heard about it. I just feel that there needs to be more information put out there, and I don't know why it almost seemed like a media attack. So there's a lot of stuff in there, and you guys did a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. I think there was a couple questions in there. Why should he get tested? And that's very true. And we are also seeing a trend with people that don't want to go see their doctor, especially if they're working the streets, when they've got an STI, because their doctor knows they're positive. Then the doctor knows all of a sudden you haven't used protection because you have an STI. So a lot of them aren't accessing care. Again, this is why we need to change the laws for our own health and for those that aren't accessing care.
I mean, I think though, there's a very difficult conversation to have with people, and everybody has a different approach to it. And I think what I might say might be different to people in Ontario, which seems to happen quite a lot, which is I think the benefit to an individual to know their status, to get onto therapy, and basically avoid the downslide of untreated HIV is overwhelming to that individual. The risk of prosecution, we have to think about it. As you said, there's 70,000 people, 175 people have been prosecuted, which means 69,000 plus other people haven't been prosecuted. So why do you assume the worst is going to happen in terms of you not taking your medications, you're not getting undetectable, you're not being able to do some of the things that we talk about? I agree the law is ridiculous. I can't even tell you how angry it makes me in terms of things, because then I would start ranting a little bit, and I'll try not to do that. I think lawyers already are reptilian kitten eaters, and this is just another proof that we need to get them on our side. I apologize if anybody's a lawyer in the room. I really think we have to try and show them the positives of getting tested, and realistically, statistically, the low risk of that happening to you. BC, I think, this case for me came out of left field, and I know from a public health point of view, they have had a lot of behind-the-scenes conversations with the justice people about it. I don't know if it was in the paper or not, but I know those conversations have happened, because everybody here completely buys into the evidence. Julio, public health people, the provincial health officer. I don't think you would find any medical person in the context of somebody who's undetectable and on therapy supporting any kind of criminalization or charge being laid in that context. In fact, Val has pointed out that we're not the arbiters of those charges. So it's definitely a very hard conversation to have, and I just try and point out the benefits over the risks of not knowing your status.
And with the case that is happening currently in BC, I happened to know about this case before it actually hit the news, and was helping out the family. And we actually went to the police department, communications, media, and said, please do not use the word victims, because that was the statement that they sent us, that this is what they were coming out with. We asked them, please do not use the word victims, and they ran with it because they felt that it would have more pop, more bang, that they might get more people to come forward. Yeah.
My question is for Dr. Hall. If it takes 6 months to be undetectable, how long does it work take to go the other way if I am undetectable and I stay on my medicine? It's not going to just happen between tests, is it?
So, depends a little bit. So I think 6 months is a long estimate. I think with some of our modern therapies, most people that we would see would be undetectable within 2 to 3 months, but 6 months is the historic number that we've looked at. The risk, unfortunately, is quite easy for your virus to rebound after you've stopped your medications. So let's say you had a treatment interruption where just life became too much and you went off your medications. A lot depends on how high your viral load was before you started your medications, because it tends to rebound towards that sort of number. So if you had a low viral load, it might trickle up quite slowly. If you have a high viral load, then it tends to rebound fairly quickly. So it's difficult to know, because we don't always have a good study where we've had people stop and follow their viral load sequentially after that, because it tends to be more of a, not a planned event that's happened. But we would say to people, probably within 2 weeks, we would see detectable viral load. And the question is, how high is that viral load? And that is hard to estimate, because a lot of that depends on what your viral load was before treatment. But there could be a risk that it could be in the few hundred range, which isn't really that serious, but there could also be a risk that it could rebound to 1,000 or 2,000 within a few weeks. So yeah, it does tend to rebound fairly quickly when you stop your medications.
Okay, because the reason I ask you that is that's people's thing of, well, how long are you undetectable for? Because everyone's, well, you could just go off that in one day. I don't think it takes a day to go off.
For sure.
If you stay on your medicine, it's pretty solid, isn't
For
it?
sure, yeah. A day,
So would you say that
a day wouldn't bother me at
You
all.
say I can have sex with my lover if I'm undetectable on my medication, it's pretty much zero?
Yeah, it is zero. So if you're undetectable, you've been undetectable, I don't think there's any risk of transmission. If you're skipping a pill here or there, realistically, it's not going to cause your virus to rebound. You need a good chunk of time where you've stopped your medications for that to happen.
That's what I was going to change.
One day, skipping your pill, forgetting your pills for one day is not going to cause your virus to come back up.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Does it discount your vulnerabilities with legal issues?
I mean, the legal issue is very, of course, different to the medical risk of transmission. Because as Val has said, the risk is not about transmission, the risk is about disclosure. Yeah. And so the law is basically, as Val said, if you are undetectable and you don't use condoms, at the moment the law says you don't theoretically have to disclose. So that's really what it is about. It's not about transmission, it's about disclosure, which is a silly way for the law to look at it, I think, in my mind.
Mine too.
So if I can just remind everyone, it's better if you have a question, come back to the microphone so everyone can hear you. Anyone else?
Anyways, Dr. Hall, yeah, thank you for those kind words of reassurance on medical terms. But on the other side, Bill, if you have sex, I'm still going to get charged, with sexual aggravated assault, and it's going to take you 4 years to challenge the court system from consensual federal. And a team of medical experts, HIV, with a scientific, study and a team of lawyers to challenge them to get out of it. I'll probably still get convicted.
I think ultimately it is going to take the challenge to the legal system. I don't know personally that the health minister or the justice minister will rewrite things. I hope they do. But I personally suspect it's going to be what you say, which is with the overwhelming medical evidence, there's going to have to be a challenge that goes up to the Supreme Court that rewrites the law. That's my personal feeling. I don't know about if you've thought about it as well.
Yeah, that's where we're headed.
Thank you.
I think that's the only way is if someone with it through having proper evidence.
I mean, I think maybe if the federal justice minister, takes us on, maybe they would rewrite the law, but my personal bias is I feel it's going to take another Supreme Court challenge. And maybe I'm just being negative, but that's my feeling.
And it takes a long time to change a law. That's what's we have a question that has come over
From webinar.
from the webinar. Can you speak to the recent changes in California laws around criminalization?
I think basically a few weeks ago, the law was changed in California to reduce what we've just been talking about. So I think it's the first jurisdiction that I'm aware of in North America that started to make progress to remove some of the criminalization. The Swiss did it after their Swiss statement over the last years, but I think in California now, they've basically removed some of the sexual assault charges that would fall to non-disclosure.
That's right. Colorado was the first, and like Dr. Hull said, California's just done it in the past couple weeks.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Hull and Ms. Nicholson, for your presentation. Really got a lot of information out of that. And I would consider myself to be quite schooled in HIV, and I've never heard this U equals U before, so I'm delighted to absolutely hear that and see the stats on that. What I'm horrified about is the criminal aspect, and this is new to me. So someone mentioned earlier, it's his word against his word, for example. What if you disclose, but who's to prove that you did disclose that? And how do you prove that? I mean, do you take your medication and you stick it beside on the pill and take a photo of them? I don't understand that. Vancouver, what I am seeing here, being sexually active in this community, is if you say that you're undetectable, guys are often relieved because you know your status. And so that's changing. But I come from the sticks, small town in Alberta, and I worry about those guys. And vindictive, bi guy, straight guy, plus the guy, whatever, it just horrifies me. So my question is, what do we do, gentlemen, and ladies, what do we do to fix this, to get this to change? I mean, we're known for marching and fighting. This is ridiculous. So what do? I mean, the young people aren't here. They're not going to do it. So what do we do? Do we lobby? Like, I don't know.
Yes, I think, well, I really do, because if I look back at the history of Positive Living BC, they were such activists. They were out there with the placards, they were out there with the coffins. I mean, we've almost come compliant, I believe, to the state that's going on. And I know of people, and this is going back a few years, of women actually saving condoms, freezing them, dating them, or having a witness. Physicians now are being totally amazing. I mean, as busy as doctors are, they're actually allowing couples to come in so that you're disclosing in front of a professional, where the professional can actually tell them about HIV or answer any of their questions. It's documented. I mean, it's really sad. And when I visualize, like, if you go into a bedroom and you're going to have sex, it's not between two people anymore. You need your lawyer, you need the criminalization team, you've got the policeman waiting, you've got the forensic people getting that evidence. Like, it just isn't spontaneous as much as it is. And signing that petition online is a good one. If you leave your email, we'll send you the link to it. And I mean, they've got to hear our voices. And I think that's the only way we're going to make change. Is like, we're not charging for any other that we're getting, and some of them are incurable. Like, why are we charging? Like, I don't want them to charge for that, but why is this one specific?
Well, I'm mad as hell, like, especially if you don't get the disease, you can still charge me, and I can,
Go to jail.
get my license stamped and spend years and years in jail. I'm mad as hell about this, and we all should be. Are we in agreement on that?
I am.
It's crazy. It totally is crazy. And I feel, I think the problem with the system is it sucks you into low-level advocacy as opposed to in-your-face advocacy. And, I think, as you say, like in the old days, people were much more visible about it. Petitions and meeting with people is all great, but sometimes I think it does need, people protesting and showing their anger in a public way, because, why else is there pressure to change anything? Like, that's what I always think with any.
Yeah, that's how they did in Colorado. They got to, every time they went to sit in whatever they sit in for Congress or whatever, they were there. They got allies. They're politicians, they got allies. They got there, they were there, they got arrested, but they changed the law.
We are known for doing this. We're known for doing this. We wouldn't have medication if we didn't fight, if we didn't march, right?
Right.
So let's do it.
Not so much as a question as an idea. I think that we need a massive, massive campaign to engage the public and for them to know that they are at risk too. And everybody should know the status, absolutely. Hopefully that we can get matching funds from the government. But I think that that's the way we have to go, is that we have to do a massive, massive information campaign to blanket this province and the country.
But that's the start of U equals U. I mean, I think we have to admire the people that have taken this on. Like, the amount of work that they've done, to develop this campaign, to encapsulate the scientific evidence in a pithy way that people can understand it, to get buy-in from basically any scientific leader in the field across the world, to have, I forget how many organizations have signed off on it. Like, it's such, I feel all like emotional when I think about it, because it's such a huge step from the community upwards. I just admire those people to the nth degree in terms of what they've achieved. And if U equals U can take off and have some of the changes legally that it has had medically, then kudos to them for that, for sure.
I think the general average Joe out there thinks that they're just not at risk. And they just are living in that ignorance, bliss, ignorant bliss. We just have to get the information out there, just plain.
And to think, if somebody does lay a charge against you, the police show up at your door, they tell you what's going on, and it may take 6 to 7, 8 months before you find out from the Crown prosecutor whether they're going to move forward or not. So imagine your life in those 6 to 8 months of living with not knowing if you're going to be charged or not, or going to jail. I mean, that's when depression sets in, that's when maybe you go back to drug use, right? It's a vicious cycle. Darren?
Thank you both. Just sort of a clarification piece for the audience is Canada actually doesn't have a law for HIV criminalization. We have no legislation for that. What we do as a country is we lump HIV into the basic criminal law. And that's why it's a big pain in the ass for the legalese world to step this back. There's a large can of worms attached to this, and they don't want to admit, oops. Our parliamentarians could correct the oops, but they like to spin on their thumbs.
Very true.
So just further to that, there is a legal precedent, and that's the Courier and the Mabier rulings that really impact this. I guess really what I wanted to say is that we're not here tonight to really be fear mongers. I really love this community because it's one of the safest communities that I feel that I have ever lived in. So I just wanted to say that it's a concern. Criminalization is a concern. U equals U is new data that's coming out, and it's really exciting. It's a good way for us to use as a basis of fighting the criminalization of HIV. And I think that we just have to be aware that even though only 175 people out of 70,000, so what's that, 7% chance that you could be, that you'll be criminalized or prosecuted, that's a very, very, very small chance. But all it takes is one person, right? You have to be the target of that person, of that law, and then it impacts you, it impacts your community, right? So thank you very much. That was a really, really impactful, insightful presentation. That's my comment.
Lowering the mic down.
Oh, no.
Like
It's gonna drop it.
Is it working? It doesn't sound like it from back here. I have two questions, basically, one for each of you. First question is, it was presented, the information presented tonight, we saw several different levels of viral load equaling undetectable. What does that really mean? We saw 1,400 in the law, 250 in one case, 50 in some cases, and 40 in other cases. So do we know what the level of undetectability is for untransmissibility? That's the first question. The second question to Val would be, can you talk about that case, where the murder case, and what does that murder case, what's different about that murder case from the other cases of non-disclosure?
I think a lot of the undetectable criteria have dropped over time. So in the original cohort studies in Rakai in Africa, they didn't seem to see any significant transmission if your viral load was 1,000 or less, with some of the crude measures that they had back in the days of how they measured viral load. Nowadays, I think for most of the modern studies, they've set a fairly clear number of less than 200 copies per mole, which is a pretty standard definition of what we consider to be in the range of undetectable. So if you think about our lab test that measures undetectable in British Columbia, which is the same as in most jurisdictions, Quebec and a few places in the US have a more higher measuring one, but ours goes down to less than 40 as undetectable. So when I'm seeing somebody in my clinic, I would say, oh, you're less than 40, you're undetectable. But we know that it's kind of a bullseye around that measurement, because that lab assay has to read from less than 40 all the way up to 10 million copies. And so it's very hard, less than 200 or higher than 10 million to get an accurate number, because it's kind of like a bullseye around that measurement. So for us, we take less than 200 is basically the same as being undetectable within the variability of that assay. So for most of the studies, they really say if you're consistently below 200, that's essentially undetectable. And for sure, there would be no transmission in that context. So yeah, I think there are different numbers. In Quebec now, their assay goes down to less than 20 copies. So you're always going to see sort of variations of this. But less than 200, we don't expect there's going to be progression of your virus. It's going to affect your health, and we would expect as well there'd be no risk for transmission, because that's within the bullseye of what is undetectable.
Okay, I'm going to give you the Coles notes on the one that was convicted. Very interesting case. I just read up on it. It was a very long process before he was convicted. But 2 of the women that he did infect out of about the 15 that they knew actually died of HIV and AIDS. So he knew he was positive. He didn't care who he was infecting. These women had no inkling about HIV or no knowledge and actually died from it. Just recently, they've appealed his life sentence because he was to get out in 25 years, that he will never get out because of the risk of reoffending. But yeah, they died.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, it looks like that is the end of our questions. So thank you, everyone. We're going to close down for tonight. Please remember to complete your evaluations, leave them on the tables for us. We will pick them up. I'd like to thank Dr. Hall and Valerie Nicholson for their presentations. Very, very insightful presentations, really interesting connections between the two. I'd like to thank ViiV Healthcare, Gilead Sciences, and Merck Canada for their support for tonight. And also I'd like to thank the Chateau Granville Hotel and the staff who worked very hard to make sure that we all got fed well tonight. So thank you very much. Have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks at that or that.